So quick review of Daniel. So as we've kind of come this far, Daniel and his friends, they're among the first wave of the exiles that are sent to Babylon from the kingdom of Judah. So the stories about Daniel and his friends in chapters 1 through 6 that we have already covered, they are for the most part about how you live faithfully when you are pretty much an outsider, right? So when you're foreigners in a foreign land. I think the writer of Hebrews captures the spirit of Daniel very well when he writes this. He says, "For this world is not our permanent home. We are looking forward to a home yet to come." And so it's this kind of idea, and you may wonder, does this idea come out of things in the Old Testament, much like the book of Daniel? And so this is an idea that I think is very much at home with Daniel and how his life is going and how the book has gone. This is not our permanent home. We are looking forward to a home yet to come. And so the book of Daniel starts off with Daniel's rejection even of the king's provisions. So that was in Daniel chapter 1, right? And he says, I don't need the food. Just give me some vegetables and give me some water and I'll be good. Then in chapter 3 and chapter 6, we had these episodes that we called a trial by ordeal, right? It was these things, this dangerous situation where it seemed like only God was going to be able to vindicate you. So there's the famous stories of the fiery furnace and the lion's den, and it was going to take an act of God literally to rescue you and vindicate you. We also got to see Daniel as this gifted dream and vision interpreter. So he interprets a couple of visions for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He interprets the writing on the wall for Belshazzar, who is the son of the last king of Babylon. And ultimately we see Daniel and his friends, they're somehow able to keep their faith and keep their convictions. But at the same time, actually, they don't dishonor the pagan kings that they're serving, but they actually even rise up through the ranks. So it's more than just trying to hunker down and keep their faith. They seem to almost prosper. Like there's a way to do this and walk this tension, and they even prosper through the reign of Babylon and Persia. And so one of the strongest themes that gets repeated is really something that the exiles during and after Daniel, they would have needed to hear. So a really strong theme in Daniel, and tonight's no different, is that what is in front of them is not all there is. So Babylon seems powerful and Persia seems powerful. It seems like they own the known world at the time. And so there's no escaping their power and their grip and their whim. But over and over and over, we see how much more powerful Daniel's God is in these situations. And so it's actually up to God when rulers and empires rise, right? When rulers and empires fall. And there's like this another layer on top of these rulers and empires that they are ignorant of. Right? So Nebuchadnezzar doesn't always realize this, and Darius doesn't always realize this, and Belshazzar. And so there's a layer on top of them that they are ignorant of, but not Daniel. And through reading Daniel, not the exiles and not us either, right? We know that there is something on top of what we see in front of us. So we see it in Daniel's lifetime, right? Babylon falls, Persia rises. We see it in Daniel's vision. So there's a large statue of successive kingdoms that comes in Daniel chapter 2. And it's like those are just different kingdoms that are coming after another, right? So an empire rises, then it falls, another takes its place, then it falls, lather, rinse, repeat, right? These things just keep going and keep going. The only thing left standing is God's kingdom. So the book of Daniel kind of has two distinct parts to it. And over the past 5 weeks, we've covered really the first half of Daniel. But if you ever just sit down and read the entirety of Daniel, you may get thrown for a loop when you start getting into the second half, the second 6 chapters. So, starting in Daniel 7, in the first half, Daniel has established himself as this gifted interpreter of dreams, right? But starting in chapter 7, it's all Daniel. So the dreams and the visions are Daniel's. Like we're looking into Daniel's own head, and you're going to find out it's like bonkers up there when you look in Daniel's own head and what's going on. So buckle up, Daniel 7. Daniel's first dream does not disappoint. So I'm going to do like I've done the past couple weeks. I'm going to read the whole part of what we're going to cover. and then we'll talk about it. And we're only going to cover Daniel 7, 1 through 14 tonight. Because, and I'll talk about this later, I think what we're going to find out as we cover this part of Daniel 7 is that these themes that we see are kind of on repeat for the rest of the book. So really, I would say your homework is to finish the book of Daniel. So we'll get enough information in these 14 verses that I think will help you just go ahead and finish the book and give you some handles to hold on to as you do it. All right, so Daniel 7, 1 through 14. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast. It looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. On its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So that's kind of our territory for tonight. Like I said, it's pretty wild. So I looked this up in case it's helpful. I found an artist's depiction of what the beast may have looked like. So there you go. I think that's early Renaissance is what that, anyway, that's actually AI. But anyway, Daniel 7 as a whole, it kind of like pivots and takes us into a new genre of literature. So up to this point, I would say Daniel 1 through 6 is really just narrative storytelling, right? It's just them kind of repeating stories over and over. It'd be hard to call it history because as we've seen, there are some liberties that were taken with these stories. We talked about that over the past few weeks, as well as the fact that the stories themselves, they kind of bear the mark of a lot of oral storytelling before they were actually put on paper. And so it's hard to really call it history. I would say it's narrative storytelling that kind of revolves around historical events, because obviously Babylon, Persia, Greece, they are historical empires that do lead. In Daniel 7, though, and through the rest of the book, we encounter a whole different literary genre. So let me ask you this. Does this short section of Daniel remind you of anything else in Scripture? Does this read like anything else that you would find in the Bible? Revelation, right? So Daniel 7 through 12 and Revelation are examples of what's called apocalyptic literature, right? So what may have just thrown us for a loop in Daniel 7 is actually something the ancient readers would have known all too well, apocalyptic literature. And so if you read the second half of Daniel, and if you read Revelation for that matter, and you just come away confused, you're not alone, right? Apocalyptic literature is notoriously hard to understand. What's funny is if you look closely in these chapters, Daniel will make a couple of references to himself, saying even he has trouble understanding what he's seeing, right? So if even the author doesn't quite fully get it, well, it's okay if you don't as well. We're going to try our best to, kind of put some handles to these things, but it's notoriously hard to understand. And there's actually a reason that it's hard to understand. The word apocalypse is kind of a loaded concept for us. So nowadays we think of disaster movies, right? And we think of asteroids hitting the earth, and we think of the end of the world as we know it, we think of apocalypse. But that's not really what apocalypse means. So apocalypse is based on this Greek word, apokalypsis, which really means to unveil or disclose or to peer behind the curtain. So a really good way to understand Revelation is to take the title kind of literally. Revelation reveals what's going on behind the curtain, right? And so this is really what apocalypse means, to kind of peer behind the curtain, to unveil. So for Daniel and for John, who writes Revelation, they're given a chance to look behind the cosmic curtain and to see everything that's going on in the supernatural world behind kind of the mundane world that we see just in historical events. And so this is why it's hard to make sense of, because imagine if you got to look at the cosmic reality that is actually happening as, say, wars are fought, right? Or as babies are born, or as people go hungry, or as a cancer sufferer passes away, or as addiction kind of strangles the life out of somebody, or as somebody else beats an addiction, right? And if you can see these things happening in front of us, but somebody says, I'm going to take you behind the curtain and look at all the spiritual stuff and battles that is actually happening when these things are happening, well, I'd imagine we'd have trouble putting it into words as well, right? At the end of the day, though, what we're going to find out in Daniel, and what you'll find out in Revelation as well, is that if you are given the chance to look behind the curtain, what you're going to see is that God wins, right? That's the most important thing that you'll see in Daniel, the back half of Daniel, and in Revelation. So we can get kind of all messed up and, wondering about all these things, and it's very intense imagery. But don't let that fool you or scare you or confuse you. At the end of the day, God wins. And that's the most important part of Revelation and of Daniel. So I don't know if you heard the phrase hot take, right? Hot take is kind of like modern slang now for if you have a provocative opinion. Well, here's my hot take on apocalypse, right? An apocalypse is actually good news, right? So we think of the end of the world, we think of things coming, everything kind of being obliterated or whatever. An apocalypse, to the real definition, is actually good news. And we'll talk more about that later. So what I want to do is, we're going to dive in. Like I said, we're going to dissect the small section, Daniel 7, 1 through 14. And we'll spend most of our time here because, as we're going to see, Daniel 7, what happens is you have a theme that just repeats and gets stronger throughout the rest of the book. So you can take it home, read the rest of Daniel, and hopefully what we've been over tonight will help you as you go through the rest of Daniel. Daniel 7, starting at verse 1. Here we go. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So already, what has happened here in this first phrase of Daniel 7? So when we last left Daniel, who was in charge in the lion's den story? Who's in charge? Darius. Yeah, Darius. Who's Darius? What empire is Darius a part of? What's that? Persia, yeah. So right now we get in Daniel 7, and it says in the first year of Belshazzar, who's king of Babylon. So what's already happened in just a few words is we've gone back in time now in Daniel. So does the book of Daniel read like a history book? No, it does not. Right? If we were writing history now, according to our standards of facts and chronology and things like that, this story would probably be between Daniel 4 and 5, not where it is today. But that's not how they wrote back then. And so what they do is they cover the whole style of literature from 1 through 6, then they move on to something different, even if it's not chronologically what happens next, right? So apocalyptic literature is what we're moving into now. Verse 1, one more time. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. And so previously, Nebuchadnezzar had been the dreamer, right? And he has a couple of dreams, and Daniel interprets for him. Now, it's Daniel who's the dreamer, right? And he's going to need some interpretation. Verse 2, Daniel said, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Remember the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the great sea. So here's a little bit, you might find this interesting, a little bit about how the ancient people of Judah would have looked at the sea. So they looked at the sea and the ocean and things like that. Very, very different than we look at it now. So we talked about this. So Megan was sitting at my table during dinner, and she's going to the beach, right? And it's exciting. So I'd imagine that we look at the sea and the ocean, and it looks for us a little bit like this sort of serene scene right there, right? So we're going to go and we're going to lay out on the sand, and we're going to frolic in the waves and go boogie boarding and all that sort of stuff. So think about the last cruise that you took or the last trip to the beach that you had, and I'd imagine an image kind of like this is what you're going to think about, right? This is not how the ancient people viewed the ocean. This is really how the ancient people would have viewed the ocean, right? A very, very different image would come to their mind. So to them, the sea was unknown, it was chaotic, it was ominous, it was destructive. And remember, this is kind of a pre-scientific time. So who really knew what was even beyond this, right? So there's so much unknown and destructive and chaotic about the sea. And so you actually see this in Psalm 46. Listen to how the author in Psalm 46 talks about the ocean. He says, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way, and even the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, right? The sea can swallow mountains. That's how scary it is. Though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake with their surging. So this is really how the ancient people looked at the ocean. They were pretty much scared of it, right? Lots of things, lots of bad things can happen when you're on the open ocean. So the beasts of Daniel 7, they don't come out of this ocean, right? They come out of this ocean. So this is kind of what we should have in mind as they are rising out. And so if they're arising out of a chaotic and destructive ocean, then they themselves are probably chaotic and destructive as well. Verse 4. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being. And the mind of a human was given to it. And so what you'll notice is that all the beasts, they have like a human an animal representative. But don't miss this, they're not literally the animal, they are like the animal. And so this is kind of their best way to describe what they're seeing. And this is really par for the course when it comes to apocalyptic literature. So if you were to look ahead at Revelation, there's lots of things where the author John says, I saw what looked like something, right? Is it literally that thing? No. This is the best way that John can describe it. So is this, in verse 4, is this kind of a dignified, courageous lion that happens to have wings? Probably not, right? This is a monstrosity, a mutated sort of creature that Daniel might be seeing, right? And the best description of it is, it kind of looks like a lion that has wings, right? So, anyway, just so we're kind of on the same page there. Also, all these animals, they represent different threats to the ancient readers that they would have been very familiar with. So especially because they're living in agricultural and herding societies and things like that. And so a lion, and as we'll keep going, a bear and a leopard, they're all predators that are going to pick off your herd, right? And so again, this is not a prideful, courageous, dignified lion. These are like menaces that they would have been aware of. And just interestingly enough, this is not in our text tonight, But they had a different view even of dogs back then. So today, dogs are our family. We love them so much. We bury them and have their ashes on our fireplace mantle sometimes. Like we get all into our dogs, right? You guys have them. I know this. Back then, dogs were menaces, right? They were wild kind of mongrel creatures. And so it's very rare to have a dog as a pet, right? We just look at animals differently today. So now the question many of us are probably wondering about, well, who exactly does the lion represent, right? Because we know this vision has got to kind of represent something. And so I think the lion is probably the one that we can say with the most certainty. It's very likely a representative of Babylon. So a very strong symbol in Babylonian culture was a lion. And so here is kind of a classically Babylonian depiction of a lion. They would have had this on their walls and things like that. And also, you have the creature being given the mind of a human, which kind of recalls back to Nebuchadnezzar's vision in Daniel 4, where he, departs from his sanity and then regains his sanity. And it talks about how he has the mind of an animal and then he regains his sanity. So that little detail kind of recalls Nebuchadnezzar there. So very likely, this is representative of Babylon. So in this vision, we're kind of getting a similar feel that we had back again. And so many of these things kind of relate back and forth. So go back to Daniel 2 and that statue, the many, many layered statue, and it represented all the empires that were coming and that were rising. And so this is kind of what we're going to get with these different beasts. But remember the definition of apocalypse here. Babylon might be what's happening on the surface, but in an apocalypse, we're looking behind the curtain. So in the cosmic realm of supernatural principalities and powers, the rising and the reign of the kingdom of Babylon was behind the curtain really a hideous, mutated beast, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at here. And so on with the other beasts as well. So verse 5. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear, so another menace to their society. It was raised up on one of its sides. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." So again, this is not really a bear. This is kind of a monstrosity, right? A grotesque, mutated sort of thing. And the best description is, okay, it looks kind of like a bear. So who is the bear? Well, in chronological order, the empire coming after Babylon is, of course, Persia. Or you might say it's the Medes and the Persians, as we talked about last week with the 2 different cultures that merged together. So the details about the bear kind of being raised up on one of its sides, that's there in verse 5. One interpreter thought that that was kind of representative of the unequal alliance between the Medes and the Persians. So there's kind of random detail about it being raised up on one side. I didn't find that, there wasn't an overwhelming thing that I saw when I was researching, but one person said, okay, that might be their unequal alliance between the 2 cultures. But to be truthful, this one's not quite as obvious as the Babylonian lion is. So Persia is basically scholars' best guess at what it was. One question here is, who is commanding the bear, right? So at the end of verse 5, it was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." So some people think that it's God commanding the bear. And as we're going to see in other parts of Scripture, the Old Testament prophets have no trouble saying that God is responsible for some of these bad things that are happening to the people of Israel and Judah. God has no trouble using beast-like rulers and kingdoms to inflict his justice on an unfaithful people. And so maybe it's God telling the bear, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." Others suggest that it's the sea talking to the bear. It's the chaos that's giving the orders. So that's the realm that the bear arises out of, and so that is who is commanding them. Here's the truth about apocalyptic literature and what sometimes makes it difficult to read. There's not always going to be a perfectly clear explanation for everything that we see. It is, in so many ways, it's interpretive, it's kind of wild imagery, and so we will not be able to find a perfect thing for every little detail. So most likely this is Persia, though, but you can't say 100%. Verse 6, after that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. One more time, not a leopard, but a monster that looks kind of like a leopard. Most scholars think that the leopard is probably Greece. So for instance, a leopard itself is fast, right? And so can you imagine how much faster a leopard with 4 wings is going to be, right? And so this might be a reference to the pace at which Alexander the Great conquered the known world. So if you've studied Alexander a whole lot, Alexander, his conquests really last about a decade, and that's all. And really, he's able to conquer Persia in like 4 years of that decade. And so it's an amazing pace that he's able to do what he did. Alexander's kind of a historical figure that, for all intents and purposes, really just didn't fail. Like, it's almost like every decision he made was the right one for what his goals were. And so he just accomplishes so much in that short period because he didn't have a wrong move. But we probably already know this. His time at the top is really short-lived. And so Alexander the Great dies at 32 years old. Having done all of this crazy stuff, he's 32, and that's when he dies. We'll come back to that. But notice the leopard has 4 heads here. So another tangent about apocalyptic literature. In apocalyptic visions, a single symbolic creature sometimes represents like an empire or a kingdom or a people, right? And then the features attached to the creature are features about that empire. So the horns or the heads or the crowns might represent significant things about the empire or the kingdom. So generally speaking, that might help you as you read Daniel and as you read Revelation. Remember that. There's beasts that might be a kingdom or an empire. There's details and features of the beast that might be details and features of the empire itself. So a creature, so for instance, the features might be the rulers of the empire, or it might be prominent cities in the empire. So the lion itself could be Greece, during and just after the rule of Alexander. The 4 heads, the features of the beast, right? The 4 heads are probably the 4 rulers that inherit Alexander's kingdom when he dies. So those pass on to, and you may recognize these names, Ptolemy, Seleucid, we'll come back to Seleucid, Cassander, and Lysimachus. And so those 4 heads are really who inherit Alexander's conquest in his kingdom after he dies. So one more time, the whole beast is the empire. The features of the beast are features about the empire. In this case, the 4 rulers after Alexander. So here's what's interesting. We're going to take a little bit of a tangent here. If you're into this, then you're going to love this. If you're not into this, I'm sorry. We're going to keep going. But when you look ahead at Daniel 8, through what we can see, we can be much more confident that this 3rd beast actually is Greece. So right here, we've identified this beast and we're focused on the 4 heads, right? Daniel 8 has another animal where 4 is an important feature of that animal, and it'll just flat out tell you it's Greece. And so if you look ahead and there's an animal that has 4 things, well, now we can go back to this leopard with the 4 heads and we're like, okay, that's probably Greece as well. So let's look at it together. Daniel 8, starting at verse 3. And it says, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal. And the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but it grew up later. Now remember, we talked about the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians were neighboring cultures. The Medes were more powerful. Then the Persians grow up kind of later, and they conquer the Medes, and they kind of merge with the Medes. And so the ram with these 2 uneven horns, one that grows up later, is the Medes and the Persians. Verse 4, I watched the ram as it charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. So again, the swiftness of Alexander's campaigns, right? It came toward the 2-horned ram, so the Medes and the Persians facing off against Alexander and Greece. It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but listen to this. Here's the important part. At the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And if that doesn't describe Alexander's early death at the height of his power, and then passing the kingdom on to 4 other rulers, then I don't really know what does, right? And then later on, a few verses later, chapter 8 just flat out tells you who they were. So if you look ahead at verse 20 through 22, it says, the 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king, Alexander. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power, which is true. They never quite could rise up to Alexander's status. So again, with everything that we now know from chapter 8 and what we see from the symbology of 4 things in chapter 8, we take that back to chapter 7 with the leopard with 4 heads, and we're like, okay, that's definitely Greece. Does that make sense? All right, so we're kind of jumping around. Sorry, but just kind of stick with me. Long rabbit trail. Let's go back to chapter 7. So, verse 7 of chapter 7, one more beast. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Who's ready to see the AI-created 4th beast? So here's what it gave me, right? And so... But here's what's interesting. So as you read through these beasts in Daniel, they become a little bit less and less like animals and just like complete monstrosities. So in the first beast, you have a lion with wings, right? And then you have this kind of menacing bear. Then the leopard has 4 heads and 4 wings. And now there's not even an animal counterpart, right? It doesn't say it looks like something because it doesn't look like anything. If it's like this, it doesn't to him look like any known animal, right? He can't even compare it. So this is just complete beast now. That is the 4th one. So a lot of people want to say that this last beast is Rome. So on the one hand, this keeps it in the neat, tidy order of kind of chronological kingdoms that come after. So truly, you do have Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome, who rule this part of the world. Also, the reference to the iron teeth and crushing its victims, we know that Rome itself was an unstoppable force, right? And they had an incredibly powerful military. Another option is that this last beast is kind of like Greece 2.0. So it's not 2.0 as in it's more powerful or it's bigger necessarily, but Greece in later years, as we're going to see here in a minute, was much, much more menacing and much more of a problem for the Jews who went back to Jerusalem. Neither option, neither Rome nor Greece, has really a great answer for what the 10 horns would have been. People have kind of dug into that and they're like not sure what these 10 horns are. But let's look at verse 8. And I'll explain why I think this is more likely to be Greece 2.0 than it is Rome. Verse 8, while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. So again, the beast is an empire or it's a nation. The features of the beast represent the features of the empire. Oftentimes it is the rulers. And so to get closer to identifying all of this, we've got to look ahead just for a second, because if you go ahead in chapter 7, Daniel gets more of an explanation about what these things are. So just for a second, look ahead at verses 23 to 25, and we'll see what the explanation that Daniel gets is. So it says this, the 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. And admittedly, that might steer someone closer to Rome, right? Rome's an unstoppable force. But let's keep reading. Then the horns, the 10 horns are the 10 kings that will come after this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. And again, neither Rome nor Greece has a great answer for what that could be. But here's the important part. Verse 25. This is the little horn that arises, he will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people. And here's an important detail, try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. So let me introduce you now to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He is the king of the Seleucid Empire. So this is still, basically in the big picture, this is still Greece, but Greece kind of gets portioned up into like these very, very distinct portions. And so a part of the bigger empire that is Greece is really the Seleucid kingdom, and Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the king. So to get to him, we have to move way forward in history, and this is about the 160s BC. So this takes a lot of time for it to happen, and so we get to Antiochus in the 160s BC. So here's the short story. The short story about Antiochus is that he begins interfering with the selection of the high priest in Jerusalem for the Jews. And how do you think they respond to somebody from the outside interfering with their religion, right? They don't like that. So Antiochus, so they respond with really a revolt. The Jews do. Antiochus then responds with like overwhelming brutality back on the Jews. So they spark a revolt, but he responds in this like overwhelming, over-the-top sort of way. So there's a book called Maccabees, which is in what's called the Apocrypha. So it's not in our canon necessarily, but it's definitely one of the books that would have kind of given shape to the Jews of that time. And 2nd Maccabees describes Antiochus' response this way. When these things happened, when these happenings were reported to the king, he thought that Judea was in revolt, raging like a wild animal. And again, you have these beasts that are coming out of Daniel, right? So raging like a wild animal, he set out from Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, that's pretty wild, 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. So Antiochus actually continues his rampage. He starts interfering with the temple itself. He sets it up not as a temple for Yahweh, but as a temple for Zeus. How do you think that went over, right? And then of all things, he is said to have sacrificed a pig in the temple. What's a pig like for Jews, right? A pig is unclean animal. And so this doesn't go well either. So really just kind of in-your-face sacrilege to the Jews. And so to them, he very, very, very much is a menacing beast to them. So just to kind of finish out the story, a man named Judah Maccabee launches another revolt. Fun detail, Maccabee actually means hammer in Hebrew. And so how awesome is it to have a revolt led by Judah the Hammer, right? That's a pretty cool name. Anyways, Judah Maccabee is successful. So here's another fun detail. Anybody know how Judah Maccabee is welcomed back into Jerusalem as he's victorious? Actually, I briefly hit it on Palm Sunday if you were here, and that's a hint right there. How's he welcomed back into Jerusalem? With palms. People wave palms as he comes back into Jerusalem. So, Palm Sunday with Jesus, almost 200 years later, is not the first time that's happened. And so here's how they misinterpret what Jesus is doing. They go back to Judah Maccabee, who's a revolutionary, who accomplishes, he pushes back the enemies with probably a lot of violence, right? And so they tell Jesus, we'd love for you to do that again, right? We'd love for you to conquer Rome like Judah Maccabee conquered Antiochus. So Palm Sunday was not the first time that it's done. So back to verse 25 of Daniel 7, though. So it said that, he says, he will speak against the Most High, and here's the details, will oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and laws. So that's probably him messing with the temple and the sacrifices, right? The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. So we can be pretty sure, again, nothing is like a first sure 100% thing. Pretty sure this looks a lot like Antiochus as the 4th beast. And he's really just made too much of an impact on the Jews to not really be mentioned here as it looks ahead to what's coming. So now, taking all this, running all the way back to verse 8, where we've been, all that tells us that the fourth beast is probably Greece 2.0, at least in my opinion it is. So it's not that the Seleucids and Antiochus were the most powerful and most fearsome on a world history scale, but they caused a lot of trauma for the Jews in particular. All right, keep going. Verse 9. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool. So the Ancient of Days is a title that only Daniel uses for God. It looks like the reference to being ancient on one hand and also having white hair on the other is probably to convey like age and stability and a long-standing reign that God has, as opposed to the beasts that we just saw rising out of chaos, and here in a minute they'll be destroyed. Yahweh, God, is instead, he is ancient and he is eternal when everything else is limited and temporary. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. So going back to Josh's week when he taught, it was Daniel 5. You had the banquet thrown by Belshazzar, and he assembles a mere 1,000 people, right? Well, now you see what the true king is able to do. And it's thousands upon thousands, 10,000 times 10,000, right? And so the efforts of the earthly kings kind of pale in comparison to what the Ancient of Days can assemble. So now we have a courtroom scene, and finally we'll see true justice for God's people here. Verse 11. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, right? Daniel was like stuck on this horn, right? I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. And I love this part because if Greece truly was causing this much trauma and persecution on the people of God, and the horn was Antiochus, right? So we would expect that this was the great villain of the story. And so you expect now there should be this epic, long-lasting battle between good and evil, right? That's how we would do it now if we were making a movie, right? The battle itself would be like a half hour long and it would just be crazy. But not so in God's courtroom. So in one sentence, the boastful horn, as well as the beast it's attached to, is just gone. There's nothing glorious about his death at all. Verse 12. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. So the phrase son of man means someone who is human-like. So if you see the phrase son of something in the Bible, usually it will mean has the nature of. Right? So if you go to the New Testament, you're going to find James and John, who are disciples of Jesus, and it calls them the sons of thunder. So really what that means is they have the nature of thunder. James and John were probably boisterous and loud and obnoxious, right? And so they're the sons of thunder. They have the nature of thunder. So the Son of Man has the nature of man. So it seems like the writer is recognizing there's a supernatural aspect to this figure. So he comes in the clouds of heaven, but there's also something human about him. So he's the Son of Man. Of course, in the New Testament, this is a favorite term for Jesus about himself and for the writers about Jesus as they talk about him, right? So we'll come back to that here in just a minute. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And again, it seems like the New Testament writers are definitely drawing on this imagery when they talk about Jesus, when they talk about God's kingdom, right? It's everlasting and it won't be destroyed. So it was the rock that destroyed the big statue in Daniel 2, and the rock was the only thing left standing. So the same with Jesus' kingdom, as he is the Son of Man, and it's everlasting, will not be destroyed, right? All right, so tonight, we've spent most of our time on 14 verses of chapter 7. So clearly, we will not get through the rest of Daniel, right? So again, that's your homework. But I think in these 14 verses, we know a lot of what we need to know to better understand the rest of Daniel as it continues. So if Daniel 7 through 12 in Revelation pull the curtain back, and both of them tell us about the end of certain things, or maybe the end of all things, well, they also confirm for us that God is victorious, right? A biblical apocalypse is good news. So, much far forward in history, Martin Luther King, he had a phrase that he liked to use in a number of his speeches. You probably heard this before. He would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. In other words, you may never see where all this is actually headed, but it is headed somewhere, and in the long run, it is headed somewhere good, right? And so he would use phrases like this to inspire hope in a 1960s America that was still profoundly struggling. And so what Martin Luther King was doing as a prophet for civil rights, well, Daniel was doing for the exiles in Babylon and Persia in Daniel 7 through 12. And so we see it in the courtroom scene of Daniel 7, right? The arc of the universe is long, but it does bend towards justice. So at its core, this is what apocalyptic literature does for God's people. And we miss this now because we've gotten the word apocalypse wrong. We've gotten the definition wrong. But an apocalypse for the faithful is good news. Looking behind the curtain should be a good experience. It may be wild and it may be kind of terrifying to see what all's there, but it is good news as we let it play out. So Daniel faces Babylon and Persia, and who knows what's coming after him. They're different earthly kingdoms, but really behind the curtain, they're monsters rising out of the chaos, and it's terrifying. But what else happens as things are unveiled? Well, God is victorious. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, but his kingdom, as it says in verse 14, his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Was that 14? Yeah. So when people read Daniel, or when they read Revelation, we can kind of easily get bogged down into kind of trying to figure out what these things mean. Like, this is symbolic of this, and this is representative of this. And tonight we covered a lot of room and a lot of territory. And honestly, the most honest answer I can give you is so much of this tonight is guesses about what the beasts actually are. I think they're educated guesses, right? And you can go and you can have things to stand on. But at the end of the day, there's no way to really know exactly what Daniel was seeing. So is this beast Babylon? Is this one Persia? Is this Greece? Is this Rome? One theologian that I read asked a really, really important question. Does it matter? Right? Does it matter who the beasts are? Does it matter who is what and when these things will happen or when they have happened? Does it matter? Because honestly, Daniel and Revelation tell these stories that are really kind of on repeat throughout history. So again, it repeats to the empires, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and it goes on beyond that. Rome falls in the course of history. The Ottomans rise up, and they're no longer a thing, right? It just keeps going and keeps going. And every time, in every era, there are beasts that rise up that challenge the kingdom of God. And they may be empire, like world empire sort of beasts, or they may be the beasts of our own lives and our own culture, right? But they're chaotic and they're destructive, and they work against God's good plans for his creation. But if Daniel and Revelation tell us about the end of all things, then they also confirm for us what? That God is victorious. A biblical apocalypse is good news. I heard a pastor, he said this, I may have said this already before, but a pastor that I used to work with, he would say, if you read Revelation and you're terrified and you think it's bad news, you need to read it again, right? A biblical apocalypse is good news because in Revelation, it's great news. Jesus comes back. It's great news. In Daniel 7, it's great news. The beasts are defeated, is what really happens. So you don't have to figure out all the details to know the important part. God wins. So as wild as it is, the back half of Daniel might give us the most important perspective when it comes to living as what feels like outsiders sometimes in this world. Daniel's visions, while they're crazy with imagery and storytelling, they're never meant to be a faith-shaking experience. They're actually a faith-strengthening experience. So this stuff was reassuring. It was actually comforting. There's a glorious future out there. You see it in verses 13 and 14 of Daniel 7. You see it in one of my favorite passages, which is Revelation 21, which I'll read for you. It says this, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I'm making everything new. And so when you read Revelation, right, if you get up the courage and you dive in and you see stuff in chapters 1 through 20 that are just wild and terrifying and you don't know what to do with, don't forget Revelation 21 and really 22 is about the same thing. Revelation ends with this sort of scene. This is the most important thing to remember as you read the wild stuff that's in the rest of the book. An apocalypse is good news because we have a God who is victorious. So, when our lives feel upside down or threatened or just like wild things are coming, don't forget the long view. We have a God who's victorious. We have an eternity to spend with him because, going back to Hebrews, this world's not our permanent home. We're looking forward to a home yet to come. Any questions?